you've got less than 10 school districts that are still using star reading. iReady was a different situation. iReady kind of rose and then peaked in the middle elementary grades and then fell off. And as you can see, almost nobody is using iReady in the high school. CASE was similar in that it rose around the upper elementary grades, middle school grades, and then you had a drop off. Probably if I had also included CASE English 2, you might have seen this number be slightly higher. If I had lumped that in with CASE ELA instead of kept it separate, you might have seen those high school numbers higher for CASE because a lot of people did use CASE English 2. And then NWEA, it was fairly consistent from K through 8 and then a drop off at high school. One of the things that's very striking in this data is that districts do not use these interim progress monitoring, however you want to call them, testing products in the high schools. They use them very frequently in the elementary schools and middle schools and not in the high schools. So again, these bars represent numbers of districts using that product at a specific grade level. This is the average number of administrations in a school year by grade. When you look at this table, this is not the overall average of how many administrations there are for that test. So what I mean by that is everybody who used star reading in kindergarten, how many times did they use it? That's why these numbers look consistent K to 12, even though we've got this consistent drop off from the previous slide, is because the number of people using star reading in the 12th grade is very small. But they're all using it the same number of times, basically. So if you look at this chart, what you see is that when people are using star reading at a grade level, they're using it on average more than 4 times a year. When people are using iReady at a grade level, on average, they're using it more than 3 times a year. When people are using CASE ELA at a grade level, they're using it on average almost exactly 3 times a year. And when they're using NWEA ELA, they're using it on average 3 times a year. This is when they're using an individual product at that grade level. So for whatever reason, people are using star reading more frequently than they use these other 3 products. Star reading was the only assessment of these 4 that people used every single month. There were some districts that used star reading every single month of the school year, more than one that did that. Whereas with iReady, CASE, and NWEA, the most that you saw a district use them was like every other month. But with star reading, we did have folks who were using it every 4 weeks. In addition to frequency, there's also the question of overlap. So how many school districts were using both star and iReady, or both star and CASE ELA, or all 4 of them, or all 3 of them? 94% of the school districts that responded said they used at least one of these, which means there were 6 school districts that said we don't use any of these tests. And they may have used another product, completely different product. They may have used no product. We only had 1 school district in the sample that said we don't use a single vendor created assessment. Everybody else who responded said we use at least one, and 94% said we use one of these 4. 23% only used one, which means only about a quarter of people use one. 70.4% use more than one of these. That does not mean they are using more of one of these at the same grade level, but some of them are, and we will look at that in a second. But most of these, at least 2 of these, are in use by most of these school districts. So about 47% of the total use 2 of the 4, Another 22% used 3 of the 4, and we had one that said they use all 4 of these at one grade level or another. So, what this slide is trying to show is that the more products you use, it's likely the more testing you're doing. We had several school districts using multiple products at the same grade. So they were using both Star Reading and iReady at the same grade level. So what you see here is this broken out by the number of tests that folks are using at that grade level and the number of times they're using. So for example, if you're only using one of those 4 products, on average in kindergarten, you are administering the one product that you use a little over 7 times a year. If you're using 4 ELA tests, on average, whatever combination of those 4 you're using in kindergarten, you are administering 8 times a year. So kids are taking 8 tests a year in ELA, possibly 3 of one product, 3 of a different product, 2 of a third product. So you can kind of see how this peaks. What this essentially shows is that when folks are using, for example, when folks are using 3 different ELA products, they are increasing the number of administrations they give up to the 3rd grade. It kind of peaks and then it goes down. And then that blue line is the average, how many administrations that folks used overall over the whole sample. So on average, if you were in the 3rd grade, if you were a 3rd grade student, you were taking 6 progress monitoring ELA tests a year. On average, if you're in the 11th grade, you are taking less than 2 progress monitoring ELA tests in a year. And on average in the 12th grade, you might be taking 1 on average, which means most people are taking 0. There were several outliers where there were some school districts that were testing 18 times in a school year in a grade, and that pulled the average up, which is why the average is around 5 or 6. But we had there's some real significant variation in the data where some school districts are at like 16, 17, 18 administrations. The most common combination was that people were using STAR with something else. So many people are using STAR. They're not just using it in K through 3, they're using it at multiple grade levels, and they're also using either iReady or NWEA or CASE.
Rachel, let me interject there and say, really try to explain why that's the case from a curriculum standpoint. STAR is the one test out of those that is different than the others. STAR is a diagnostic test that is dealing with skills, reading skills. It gives you a reading level, whereas the rest of them, NWEA, EA, and iReady and CASE, are curriculum-based, that is testing the standards that are being taught. So when if a district is using STAR, they're constantly looking at that student's reading level, their skill level, and is it growing or dropping, in addition to another test where they're looking at, is the content being taught in that grade level, the standards being covered. Those other tests would cover that. So that's why you'll see most districts using STAR and something else. STAR is not really, it's an outlier in that. And
I can speak to NWA, and I agree with you 100%. The NWA is a computer adapted test, and so it's based on standards, but it's just, for our district, it allows us to see, for a student, to see how, say, low performing or how low they actually are, because when you take a standards-based test, it's based on certain standards, and it's not necessarily gives you a full accurate measure of how low a student or how high a student performs. And the NWA is a nationally normed test, so that we can actually see how our students compare to the national student, on the national average type.
So anyway, what the data set looked like was that when people were using multiple tests, there were districts that were using multiple tests at all of the same grade levels. So they're using star reading K through 8. They're also using iReady K through 8. Often, though, it looked like they're using star reading K through 8 and they're using iReady 4 through 8. Or they're using star reading K through 5 and they're using iReady 3 through 8. So there was some overlap, but not perfect overlap. That was most often what the pattern looked like. But there were some where they were using 2 tests in the same subject at the same grade level for everything. And they were using one, and typically they would be using one product more than the other product, so more frequently. But in general, this is what the pattern looked like. The more testing products you were using, usually that meant you were testing more frequently throughout the year, because if you have 2 testing products, you're going to use each one of them at least once. So that means that you're going to probably test more frequently. Yeah. I didn't have time for that. That's something someone could do, and then in another phase of analysis, but I just didn't have time in a week. Here are some considerations. We have a lot more data. We could answer more questions about that data. It is a very large data set. It is a very complicated data set, as I said. There's not been any cleaning of the data, so any attempt to go back and call folks and say, did you really mean this when you wrote this here? Are you really using star reading every month and using iReady 8 times a year? So everything that has been presented today is what people put into the database. What was presented here is a small piece of what people responded with. I think it's important that we think about testing as more than just frequency. So I honed in on what folks were using and how often, but really the testing picture in a district looks like, how often are you using a product? How long does it take you to administer that in terms of number of minutes the child is sitting there taking the test? And then how much time does it take the district to test all students using that product? If you add all of those things together, that's really like the amount of effort that a district is using on a particular test. So if you have a test that you're testing with every month, it takes 60 minutes, and it takes you 20 days to test every single student in your building, that's a lot of time and effort for a single test, even though an individual student is only spending 60 minutes, but it's a lot of teacher time and effort on that test. And then if you're using multiple products like that, so then it's a lot more testing effort, right? It starts to get to an additive effect. And this is before we even start talking about state testing. So when we look at that, that's just one piece of the puzzle. The other piece is, does the amount of time and energy that folks are using to analyze that data once they've made that investment match the amount of investment they're making from the get-go in taking the tests? So you can look at this previous slide where it says, in kindergarten, a kindergartner who is in a district that has 3 different ELA tests is on average taking a progress monitoring test about 7 times a year. Every time they take that test, or whatever product it is, every administration of that is the same amount of energy put into analyzing that data, changing instructional practice, and making it worth it to the student and the teacher as was put into administering the test. That is a question that is difficult to answer from this data, but it's a really important question, because you could see a situation in which one district might be testing a kindergartner 7 times a year, but that's really valuable because they're doing something with that data, whereas another district is testing a kindergartner 7 times a year, and it just feels like a nightmare for everybody involved because they're testing and then it's over and nobody ever looks at it again. And there's no effort being made to change instruction based on that data. And you know, depending on which district you're in that hypothetical, you may have a very different feeling about testing 7 times a year. Some people might think it's critical, and some people might think it's a complete waste of time and they hate it. And that can change what they think about testing. So that's a question that I didn't answer today, and is not, there's some maybe answers in the data set, but not total answers. And then finally, what is the role of technology in all of this? So I scanned the database or the data set to try to see what people said about why it took them more or less time to test all of their students. Because we had some folks who said, it takes me 20 days every single time I do an administration of star reading. 20 days to test everybody. Other people said it takes me 3. And you can imagine that star reading, CASE, NWEA, iReady, they're all computer-based tests. And so if you have good access to technology and you're testing using that product 3, 4, 5 times a year, maybe it's a lot more seamless if you have more access to technology than if you have less. And then it adds to that testing, you know, it increases the time to test all students, which increases the amount of testing effort. So one of the big pieces I think we still need to struggle with is whether or not there is a state role in providing more specific investment for technology for schools to enable folks to have test-capable devices, not just for state testing, but for district testing when they want to do interim tracking. And, you know, in the last 40 years, can anybody remember a legislative effort to specifically purchase test-capable devices? No, right? The expectation is people are supposed to take it out of their district budget or MAP or wherever they come from. There's E-rate, but that's really not for buying laptops or, you know, iPads or whatever, whether that's for testing or for some other instructional purpose. So that, and yet, you know, like nearly every single one of the assessments that people said they're using are computer-based. They're not really using paper pencil tests, either, you know, at the district level. And we know all of the state tests are computer-based. So that there is a huge issue with that. So with that, I'm going to open it up for whatever thoughts people have.
That we had some answers in the data, but not a lot. Did we? I know
Yes.
we got a few questions in the proposed teacher survey, but remind us what we had in the district survey.
So there were, in the first survey, there was really questions about, there were some questions about how useful do administrators find it, how useful do teachers find it, and they were supposed to say 1 through 5 how useful. And then there was a question, how much time does it take to get the results back to users? But in this particular survey, there weren't questions like, what is the structure for analyzing data?
How do you use the data?
Right, or how do you know that teachers have changed their instructional practice based on, you know, there weren't questions like that to try to dig into, okay, you said you were using star reading once a month. What happens then? Or you said you're using star reading once a month and you're using iReady 4 times a year. How do you use those two things? What happens then? There weren't questions like that in this first survey, but that can put a completely different cast on things like what you're using and how often. Because like I said, testing is in and itself only as useful as you're going to make the data. And if the data is not useful, you could have a beautiful system for testing and it is completely pointless and everybody hates it.
Yeah, and I guess I wanted to make a comment on that same vein. While I appreciate the recommendation around the fiscal piece with adding additional systems, I don't think necessarily that gets to the root cause of some of the issues that we're seeing. And I don't know if that's a professional development or if that's a best practice. While I appreciate local control, I do think there needs to be some type of I guess, PD, around how we test, for what purpose do we test, and how we use the results of those tests. Because it still seems to be fairly apparent, especially when you mention certain districts are using all 4 of the tests, that there is some misalignment in the state. When we read the Mississippi First study, what we saw was that sometimes individuals were almost trying to recreate a sports analogy of, if we continue to practice, then hopefully we'll play better. But certainly the assessments that we have now at the state level don't necessarily lend themselves to that methodology. So I do think one of the recommendations needs to be around building capacity of either district administrators, building level administrators around what is appropriate in terms of testing, what are you doing with the results? Because I agree, to test for the sake of testing does not actually get back to the instructional level in terms of creating change. So I do think that has to be a part of the conversation, and perhaps individuals would be more receptive to the assessments if they saw where I can take this information the next day and make the needed changes that I really need to have in my classroom. And I think that's part of the disconnect that we see materialize in some of the conversations we hear publicly around testing.
I think we also have to be careful. I'll go back to my previous comment about the difference in STAR testing and other products such as Ames Web or others that are skill-based, diagnostic, and you're using those in a progress monitoring fashion where you're working with a student and you're testing them every 2 weeks, every 3 weeks to see if what you're doing in the classroom is having an effect, like taking their temperature that a doctor would, versus testing them on standards and curriculum the teacher's teaching over and over and over. I think that gets redundant, and that's what we need to focus on. But the diagnostics, the skills, that's going to be determinant on the skills of the students. And I think that's why you see so much more testing, especially with STAR at the early grades where you're teaching reading, because you're needing to progress monitor those kids and see, are they growing in their reading levels. So if we muddy the water, so to speak, when you throw in STAR in with this, it kind of gives a picture that there's more testing going on than really that there is, because the STAR testing and things like it are going to be, that diagnostic is critical to know, is a student learning to read or not? Well, how do you know if they're learning to read? You've got to sit down with them and see if they can read or not. And you listen to them, and that's what a STAR test does. It's looking to see, if their comprehension skills are getting better, how many words per minute are they reading. I think we kind of muddy the water in that when we throw that piece of data in with the curriculum-based tests that are looking at the standards.
STAR was the assessment that we all had to use to a certain extent around going toward third grade gate. I feel like to a certain extent STAR was kind of muddied by virtue of the fact that that was the assessment that we had to give for a while.
Right.
And so all of us were, under this to give that particular assessment. Now that we're kind of walking away from it, I don't know, the results may look completely different next year.
Well,
districts are reluctant to get away from it because of the environment of testing, and we don't want to change what we've already been doing. We've already had this in place, and so this is what we're, I hate to say comfortable with, but this is what we've been doing, and we don't want to go to something new, because also you have all of this data that you have from previous STAR testing, and so when you start a new assessment tool, you have to start a new database, which you can't always compare apples to apples. So a lot of times when you start that product or that program or that testing, you pretty much want to kind of stay with it so that you can have that longitudinal data.
Are all, kind of like
yeah. And I could pull it out, but I think what was really striking about, if you saw the full spreadsheet with all 98 responses in K through 12, is that while there were districts that looked like they were being very intentional about STAR and we're using it in the early grades, and then maybe we have one grade of overlap with iReady and then we're using iReady, or we're using something else, almost everybody who was using STAR was using it beyond third grade. And in addition, they were also using something else. So like we did have districts where they had STAR K through 3, and then 4 through 8 they picked up with something else, and then maybe in high school they had something else. Or like I said, they had 1 or 2 grades of overlap. But we had several districts where there was perfect overlap, you know.
But you saw STAR at high school.
Yes, yes.
And that's going to be used in the tier process, and then.
But remember, this is for every. The question was, what do you use for every single student in a grade?
But again, they're using it as a universal screener to see which students need to be identified to go into some type of tier intervention,
or even IEP meetings for our special education students because you have that baseline data in kindergarten from the STAR, and you continue that longitudinal data. You're able to write those IEPs over the many years to show what capabilities that they've. But it doesn't mean every kid. I mean, they're using.
This is every kid. This is every kid. So we did not have, like, if you look at this slide where it said how many were using it at that grade.
And I would say that maybe they use it for every kid, because if I'm using it for my tier process, I'm using it for my special education students. Why do I need another product to monitor my students, and I just monitor them at the same time to reduce the number of testing? Because if I do STAR for my special education student, my tier process, and say I do CASE for my other students, I'm going to have to do CASE for the special education students in the tier process too, to be able to get that data to see how the whole grade or the whole cohort of students are performing on those standards or this, that, and the other. I'm just speculating.
Myself as well. The districts that would concern me, and I don't know, we don't have a list of who they are or whatever, would be the ones that are using every one of the curriculum, the standards-based tests. They're using iReady and CASE and the NWEA and one of the others, and they're giving those multiple times because those products should give you the same data. STAR is going to give you a different set of data on a student, and NWEA will too, because it's adapted. Will give you a different set of data than those standards-based tests.
You have to also remember what you're saying here, and which was mentioned earlier, is the data is not cleaned up. We're not sure what some of those districts.
And there may be one or two errors in there, but over 98 districts, when you see a clear pattern emerge, I think what we're seeing is when you look at it, you can sort of tell when you look at the numbers, what they're using, how many times, who has been very intentional, and who is maybe using something because they think they're supposed to, and using it maybe more than they should, maybe out of some sort of belief that it's going to help if you use, this testing product 5 times a year and this one 5 times a year, even though they're giving you the same data. I think that the other thing to remember is that when you look at the math, I didn't put math up here, but when you look at it, it looks very similar. It looks very similar. So, some of the STAR reading is probably driven by the MCAS, especially in the early grades, but there is not a terribly significant difference between the number of people using STAR math in the same way, using iReady math, using CASE math, using NWEA math. The pattern looks very similar. And I think that, I would, if I had a lot of time and didn't have another job, I would want to go back and ask some of these folks, why are you doing it this way? Why are you testing this product this many times and then this product this many times when they're giving you the same data? And then when the test is over, what are you doing with the information?
That is the key. But I just want to, and I'll be quiet after this. The STAR and those skills-based tests, let's put it in medical terms, they'd be like taking a temperature or a blood pressure or something that can change very quickly and can change. You can take your blood pressure every day, you can take your temperature multiple times a day, and you can get different readings. If I take the CASE test today and I take the CASE test 2 weeks from now, if I take it and the student does, I shouldn't see a lot of variance. Okay, I shouldn't see they ought to score the same today as they scored there. because if there's no new material taught, it's basically what's been taught. Whereas STAR and those types of products are looking at skills where you can have a lot of variance very quickly. So I can see where you would do, especially if you're working with a student in the tier process to see if they need to be tested for special ed, you would do progress monitoring every 2-3 weeks, and you could see growth or not growth in that student using one of those products. It'd be, you know, the other test would be like a big test that you would take, a CAT scan, an x-ray. You're not going to see a difference in an x-ray in 2 weeks, in 3 weeks, but you can see a difference in a blood pressure or a temperature in 2 days, 3 days, depending. And if you're giving medicine, you want to see if it's going up or down.
So I think that there's a lot more that we could think about when we look at the data set, and a lot of other questions we could try to see, well, what does it look like if we ask this question and we pull out these pieces of data? I think in general, what this shows is that, yes, people are using, there are certain products that are very common across the state. Multiple school districts are using them. They're using them in a discernible pattern. You know, most often, probably if you tried to figure out what was the most often pattern or schedule for STAR reading, it would be 3 times a year. You know, the majority of school districts said we use STAR reading 3 times a year. And then you had some that said we use it every month, and then some that said we use it 6 times a year. And then we got answers that were like 8 and 10 times a year. But that was not as common. iReady, most common, you saw 3 times a year. CASE, you kind of saw differently. Some people said twice a year. Some people said 4 times a year. That one was different. NWA, you said 3 times a year. But the question really becomes is when you start adding them together, you're using STAR 3 times a year and iReady 3 times a year and NWEA, ELA 3 times a year, then you start getting to, you're giving an assessment 9 times a year. Is it really giving you enough different information those 9 times a year to make it worthwhile that you're giving something 9 times a year? And that, we can't answer that with this, but I suspect that for many folks, the answer is no. And they just haven't thought about it critically enough to, as a community, to figure out how we should be doing this differently. Because this is for every single student in your school. It's not for, you know, you're trying to test this child more often because they have, you know, you're looking for something. This is every single child. You're stopping school for every single child. How many times a year? For what? And then we haven't even started talking about state testing, right? Which is a whole other thing at the end of the year. So this is all before state testing. This is all how many times you're testing before you even get there. So it's just very complicated. And yes, I think there are certain answers to this that are practices that districts are using that are probably not only defensible, but good. And then there are other things that could look very similar, but actually are not productive at all for folks to be doing. And I think, like Dr. Coleman said, like that is a much harder nut to crack. There's not, I don't know what kind of law you pass to make people make better decisions, you know?
Yeah, I don't know if it's a law or whether or not it's just really great guidance. Because you know, as I sit here and think about it, I don't recall, and Nathan, I thought, Nathan's here? Yeah. I don't recall if there's like a specific professional development for administrators on the other than even our program studies and going through coursework. But I don't know that there's necessarily a PD or guidance document that says, here is what this type of assessment would be used for, and if you're having this particular issue instructionally, perhaps you should investigate. I don't know that there's, you know, or even how to craft what the data team meetings look like afterwards. All of that's pretty organic and it's kind of left up to the district, and I don't know that there's strong guidance or even PD around that. I mean, I think we've all kind of done it ourselves in our own way.
My role in our district, you know, I deal with a lot of data and assessment data. And I can tell you, data from one grade to the next, and as I go through our district and work with the teachers and administrators looking at data, there's no one way, one right way, and it goes back to I tell administrators, art and science to teaching. Well, the science could be data, but data, there's an art to looking at data and discerning what the data is trying to tell you, what trends and where it's going, and so there's. Absolutely, I think, and I work with administrators in our district not to give them the information, because it's kind of goes back to teach a man to fish, or teach them to fish, or give them a fish or teach them to fish, and so it's more of my questions to them is working with them to help get them to see where they're wanting to go. First of all, I think you have to understand where you want to be, what's important, and so what is this data leading you to where you want to be, and that sort of thing. So I work with them basically to be able to discern for themselves and work with their teachers and ask those same questions and lead them in those discussions about the data.
And so even if we can get to the point of providing things like guiding questions that people could just use as suggestions, perhaps that would be helpful. I just think there's an opportunity to really help districts around this work.
Most important thing that I tell teachers and administrators, there's more to that data point. That number is a representation. There's more to that, whether that student had a bad morning or you can't make decisions based on one data point. If I stepped on the scale one time a year, that's not going to tell me, and so you have to build this, I want to say profile, or build this and look at it from multiple just patterns, so to speak, to be able to say, I know this, because when say like from a district standpoint with a district of almost 11,000 students, I don't know those students. I can look at a student's name and look at their score, and I'll tell them, because I have teachers and I don't know where that student was before, because it might be good for one student to be at the highest level, but say in advance, if that student was minimum and then that score is basic, well, that score might be good for that student. So you can't just always make assumptions about a data point, and you have to be able to look around and see what encompasses those things. And so that's the hardest thing for us, because we as educators, we always, one way the only quantitative we measure by grades and this, that we're used, and when we see a number, we're used to saying, okay, that's good, that's bad, and making judgments based on just what our perception of that's good or bad, So
I wonder if maybe the multiple pieces of file as
correct.
Opposed to
Correct. And we use that in our district. We use some of the.
I don't know if that's fact. I'm just
No,
saying.
we use some of the. We use teacher-made tests. We use district common assessments, and we use NWA and some of these vendors to put it together and look at a holistic picture of the student, the class, the cohort. I mean, from a student level all the way out to teacher grade level, school level, and we build this picture, putting those. It's like pixels. It's like pixels on a screen.
But I think the layering of the same type of assessment.
That's right.
Is unnecessary. Yeah, and we're very intentional about what assessments we give, and it's not duplicating and making sure.
And you're Lamar County, right? I remember what your line looked like, and yes, I could tell that you were intentional about like the assessment products you used at what grade and how many times.
We actually made some decisions. Say for example, we felt like the NWA 3 times a year was too much, so we're only giving it 2 times a year this year. And so that last year it would say 3 times a year, but we sat down as an administrative team, principals and all, and said, okay, are we getting the data that we're getting from that assessment, is it what we're
Valuable enough. That's right.
felt like the fall test, because there was that summer slump, was not a valuable data point. So we wanted to give some instruction, give that test, say October, November, then we'll take the spring data point, and we're looking from growth from spring to spring from student level.
We've done the same thing in Clinton. We 2 or 3 years ago, when we started getting our state test results back in a timely fashion, we used it as a baseline score, and we used to use CASE 3 times a year. We only use it twice a year. We do a midterm, and then we do a spring, and teachers were very pleased with that. I think what I'd like to ask Dr. Oakley and those from the department here, we've got a mountain of data here that we've never had before, which is wonderful. I think it's very valuable information. But are there people at the department, or where can we go? Who can we identify? Who can we partner with, if it's Mississippi State or someone else, to help us disaggregate this and analyze it to where we turn this data into some usable information?
Right. So two topics. First, there is some guidance out around universal screeners, diagnostic assessments, particularly for K-3, determined by the reading panel back in the spring. That's on the student assessment website. So that is available, and does refer to some foundational, technical, and content criteria for selection and use of those screeners. The second question, Dr. Martin, connected to the data analysis. We've already had some discussion internally this morning with executive leadership about what that would look like to get this done outside of Rachel having to do that work. And so Mr. Craman does have staffer, Dr. Lee, who's on the OTSS team, who we're going to put in touch with you, Rachel, to see what we can do to expedite some further analysis on this information.
Helpful for us to, and maybe not, but do you think it'd be helpful for us to codify the type of information that we're looking for, just so they're not like squirrels looking? You know what I mean? Because it's a huge data set, but there's certain pieces of the data that we're more interested than not.
I think that would be helpful to kind of frame up where we want to go with this, so it's not just a wide open
right.
And so
study.
We have a list of questions that the task force generated way back in like August that we wanted the survey to answer, and then the survey was built around trying to get data that might answer those questions. So we could go back to those questions and see, okay, now that we have the data, what are the answers to these questions? Which is a little bit how I did this today, because people said, we want to know what folks are using. And
a great opportunity to dig a lot deeper into it.
Yeah. And what I am worried might happen in some districts is that some districts might look, who are not right now using CASE, for example, might look at this and say, everybody's using CASE. Now I need to add CASE. And then suddenly they're going to have STAR and NWE and CASE, and that, I don't know how we communicate that, right? Because it's not the fact that Clinton uses CASE that makes Clinton an A-rated school district, right?
It's what any of those products will get you where you want to go if you use them correctly. Okay, there's not a magic bullet there with CASE or NWEA or ELS or any of the products. It's how you use the data that you receive from them to drive your instruction. And so that's the key. And I think there does need to be, maybe, as Dr. Potter said, a more concerted effort, maybe statewide, for us to bring and help raise the capacity of all districts. Some districts are so small that you're looking at one person that's doing that. And so, you're asking a lot of individuals, even some consortiums around the state where you bring several districts together and they look at, themselves and look at their data together would be helpful.
And so, especially when we start getting into what high-performing school districts do and what low-performing school districts do, I don't want us to get into a conversation where we're like, well, high-performing school districts take STAR reading and CASE, and that's it, and they do it on this schedule, and say that is the practice that everybody needs to adopt. And so as we're doing this analysis and we get more and more information, we need to be careful about how we make people understand it, because the name of the product you're using is not probably as important as what you're doing with it once you give it. And again, on the teacher side of things, whether you're making a teacher give NWEA 3 times a year or CASE 3 times a year or iReady 3 times a year, if at the end of that the answer is, okay, now you have this data, go do your thing, that's probably not very helpful to a teacher who's been given the entire burden of using a test effectively every single time it's administered. So yeah, that long way to say, Nathan, I will respond to an email when I receive it.
And I think that's a perfect segue to get into let's looking at the teacher survey that we have before us. Unless there's any other questions, those of you on the phone, any other questions concerning our data set here and going forward, it sounds like we'll have some more actionable data coming forward from this data set. But we've heard this survey was to district leaders, district personnel. The missing piece of that puzzle is what you have before us is hearing from the teachers. And so we have the teacher survey that we've worked on a couple of months now. We had a subcommittee that came together and formulated, and we pulled from that first survey, we pulled questions from it to create this. Last month we came together and we kind of wordsmithed a little bit together and tried to clean it up. And if we can come to agreement today with what you see before you that's redlined, those are the additions and the cleanup that the department helped us with from our last meeting. If we can get this finalized today and get it to our friends at Mississippi State so that we can send it out to districts to be sent out to teachers, I think this is a really, you add that data set that we already have with this data set, I think we can really have some wonderful information to look at. So this was sent out to you by email by the department, and instead of just going through question 1, 2, 3 as we did last time, I think just, let's just start and see, does anyone have concerns with any of the questions as you see them written? Are there any further modifications that need to be made?
Question 6, I guess this is maybe an question to the committee. It says, the answer to question 5 is having used the results that realize do we want to list how teachers use the results if the answer is yes to question 5. So is that asking this committee whether or not we want to keep that question? Or?
I read that as when you decide do we want to give them a drop-down list to choose from, or if we want to leave it open-ended there.
So that they can write their own.
Yeah, that was.
I think you're correct. And we talked about that we'll get cleaner data if we give them a drop-down menu of some choices than if we just have it open-ended for them just to write.
Dr. Coleman's point that question reflects trying to find out what we're talking about is this data driving instruction, and that's a really important question. I don't know how to drop that down in a way that you get really valid data out of that, but that's a huge question for us. I think find out where the real gap is, and I think we're more data savvy than we've ever been, but it hadn't driven instruction, and so that question is going to be vital, I think.
Well, and there are other questions that you go on. If you go to question 9, what's the intended purpose of the assessment? You have a drop down there that gets at that. Question 10, who's expected to use the results? Question 11, to what degree do you as a teacher find this helpful?
Yeah, it looks like the questions are not numbered continuously. The numbers start over.
It's because if
Whatever you
it's
choose.
not like state tested, then it goes to a different set of questions, right?
Right. Right.
On question 6, could we do it like we did question 9 and give like some examples, but if they want to go more in depth, do another drop down where they could type?
Question 6.
See, because for those of you that weren't with us, what's happening is you've got on question 1, you're identifying if you're a tested teacher or a non-tested teacher. If you're a tested teacher, you're going to answer every question in this survey. If you're a non-tested teacher, you're going to stop at question 5, or question 6. Okay, you're only going to take those first couple questions, and so that's why I think question 6 is so vital, to get that set of teachers' ideas, even though they're not tested teachers. What do they feel like is testing useful in a school setting?
So I guess my question about that then is question 6 to me, and I am an art teacher, but the question says, how do I use these results? That's not necessarily asking my perception of how the results are used by the other teachers that are actually testing. That's asking specifically how would I use the results. So if I'm a non-tested teacher, I would be able to answer that specifically.
Right. But in some districts, I mean, in our district, we provide test data to our accent teachers, to our, so that they know that information on those students, and they can use that to help drive their instruction. I think it'd be valuable if I'm an art teacher to have some of this data on my students.
I understand that as a kind of maybe intended question, but I don't know if
I agree.
That question that.
How do we make that more clarified? Because I think the idea of this question was, from their perception as a non-tested teacher, are you provided state or district assessment results? Okay, I'm a non-tested teacher. If the answer to that is no, I'm an art teacher, I don't get the results. I'm done. But if I say yes to that, if I answer yes to 5, I am provided district and state assessment results for the students I teach. I'm a non-tested teacher, I'm an art teacher, I'm a music teacher, but I get provided results. Then how do you use those results? Okay, you got to read those together. If I don't get results given to me, I'm done. I'm done at 5. But if I answered yes in 5, then 6 comes into play. That makes sense? And then for the tested teachers, the teachers who have a tested area, that's where I was getting at. You go on to question, it's on page, 5 or 6. You get on to question 9, which talks about the intended purpose of the assessment. Question 10, who's expected to use the results. 11, 12. You get a lot deeper in the dive for those teachers because they are the tested teachers. Anyone else? Anything else that jumps out at you that you have a question about? Our friends at Mississippi State, are you still with us?
Yes, sir. I wanted to ask a question. So if you, for the non-testing teachers, I understand, and they say yes, they get the results. You want to know if they use them at all. And the way you set up the questionnaire, it's an open-ended question. So let me just point this out. If you have a list of what you are pretty sure are the possible answers, you're more likely to get responses by a drop-down menu, a list that people can check all that apply, than if you ask an open-ended question. So just keep that in mind. I mean, this is, just responding to surveys. People are much more likely to respond to a survey where they have options to choose from than to take the time to write out, an answer to an open-ended question. The other thing to keep in mind is the analyzing the data. If you give them a choice, and then the last one on the list could be other reasons, please, specify or explain. It's a lot easier for the people doing the evaluation, the analysis, to quantify the answers when it's, you know, a list. It takes a lot longer because we're talking about reading every question, answer, and then categorizing it in order to provide a report to you. So the man hours required, especially if we're talking about, y'all, writing Mississippi State was between 20,000 and 30,000 emails. Now, I don't believe for a second that 100% of the people are going to participate in this study, but even if 10%, that is a lot of data that my graduate student and I would be reading every single answer and categorizing. So, you know, I think you should, I mean, I'm not opposed to open-ended questions, and we probably should have some, but if, like on question 9 for the tested teachers, you have what is the intended purpose of the assessment. So you've already listed a bunch of options. So if you have an idea of what the possible answers might be, I think that would be a better way to go and still give people the option to answer, but I think you get better data that way.
Point well taken, and I agree with you totally. We just need to come up with what that drop-down menu would be and look at. So we do give them an open-ended on question 10. If they're a non-tested teacher, are there any other questions, concerns you wish to share? And that will be, you know.
Yes, and I think you should keep that. I'm not saying you
Sure.
shouldn't, but the more open-ended questions you provide, the longer it's going to take for us to analyze the data.
Agreed. Can someone let's try to tackle that on question 6? What would a drop down menu look like? What would we put there? Because I think or which ones from Q9 could we pull into it?
Subject, but I just had a thought, so I wanted before with the ELS, and you said we didn't know if it was ELA or math. Of this, would it be appropriate on this survey to send out and put in the list of these assessment ELS, math? You know what I'm saying? To be able to get that data, and it might help us clarify what that ELS is on the district data.
Probably.
All right, I didn't mean to interrupt the conversation with question 6. I just had that thought, and if we need to come back to that, we can.
Looking at question 9, enable teachers to make instructional decisions such as skill remediation, ability-based grouping, or pace acceleration. Is that one we want to include there as a drop down on 6? Yes. Enable teachers to assign grades. No. Enable users to determine skill or standard mastery. For a non-tested teacher. Okay. Enable users to predict student achievement on state assessments. They're not a tested teacher.
Not going to make any predictions on state assessments anyway, right?
Enable administrators to place students into appropriate courses. Enable administrators to hold teachers accountable. Enable students to earn a credit or credential. Motivate students. And then other. So the only one to not use would be 4 and 5.
I would say leave appropriate courses because there's some, say in high school setting, there's some courses that are passed the state assessment, say biology, say science for biology.
So why are they in my course? They didn't, yeah.
able to take a more
Right,
advanced course.
right.
And
Okay.
Question says, how do you use these results? And so that non-tested teacher isn't going to be placing students into courses. Does that make sense?
next higher level courses.
What if we take the words enabled administrators out? We say proper placement of students in appropriate
That's
courses.
absolutely. I think that.
Okay. So we're looking at a drop-down menu of 1, 3, 5, 6, 7, and 8. And no, and leaving other as well. Y'all good? Okay.
But that's just me, y'all.
How would they know? I'm just writing. Y'all talk to me. 1, 3,
5 with
5.
your adjustment with your edit.
The proper placement of students into appropriate courses.
Not 6.
Not 6. 7. Yes. 8. Yes. And then other. Okay. Good question. And I think that's one of the pieces we ask it in the other part. In some places, vendor created tests and these are being used as part of students' grades. And I think we need to know that or want to know that. Is that a good practice? Is that a bad? I'm agnostic on it, but
There is a state law in place that prohibits the use of pre-state group
but promotion and retention purposes is not necessarily part of a grade that goes in a grade book. That is, I know personally across the state that there are places where these types of tests students are receiving grades for.
It said that in the data set.
That's okay. Last time. 1, 2, 4. No, we didn't say 4. 1, 2, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. Is that correct? We came back and added 2 though, right? So 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. Patrice, are you getting this?
Isn't it everything
Okay.
but 4 and 6?
Everything but 4 and 6. Okay. And 5 we took out and said enable proper placement of students into appropriate courses.
And 6 was just mentioned and discussed a little bit just a minute ago. But I just wonder if when you talk about teachers holding teachers accountable, could that be used for accountability for collaboration? with teachers. I mean, is that what that could refer to?
It could be. You know, you've got English 1 teachers in 9th grade who don't give they don't give a benchmark test or anything, but they are held accountable to help prepare those students for English 2. And so are they given the English 2 results so that they know how their students, when they were in English 1, scored, and to help hold them accountable. So that's a valid point. So 6 might need to be included. So enable administrators to hold teachers accountable.
Should we say enable teachers to better collaborate or something like that? So that it's more about vertical,
Yeah.
you know, alignment as opposed to, I guess, accountable, I think is going to throw people off. But they're going to automatically reference that back to the administrator. And what I hear you talking about is more of an organic process with teachers, teaching teams. Give teachers the opportunity to better collaborate. Yeah.
Promote collaboration, something of that nature. Okay. Anything else? So with those edits, do y'all feel confident for us to get this finalized and to our friends at Mississippi State? And then process will be that they are going to send out, as I see it, as I've understood it, they're going to send an email from the department with a link. Am I correct? Is this going to come from Mississippi State? Is this going to come from the department? Okay, because I think there'll be an email that will come to each district superintendent with a link that then they will forward to their teachers in their district with a link to the survey and
I don't think this is the folks on the line. Do we have any idea, I mean, how long they think it would take?
Well, that depends on whether they're a testing teacher or a non-testing teacher. Obviously, a non-test teacher, we're talking about 5 minutes, maybe, for a non-testing. You're talking about maybe 5 questions, unless they decide to write a long essay on how they use the test. For the teachers that do test, it's going to be driven by, even though you're looking at 22 questions or so, the reality is that a number of these questions are linked to how many of the tests
Right.
is checked. You look at the question 5, please select the name of every vendor-created assessment that you use for all students. So if they mark 5 of them, they're going to get a set of questions, the follow-up questions, 5 times. So the only thing I'm a little worried about is, teacher fatigue. So if you're only using 1 or 2, again, if you answer, that would be like, let me count real quick. So after you do that one, we're talking about.
Very few districts that were using all the vendors.
Yeah, this was very
take that
similar.
into-
This was very similar to the district survey, depended on how many, and you went through that same bank of questions for each assessment. And is that important, or do we need to make those questions global? They still choose the vendors that they use, but just make them go through that set of questions one time so that you get a global response? Or is it important for us to get that information about each individual assessment?
30 minutes is a long time to ask the teacher. Anything, that's a long time.
But it's going to depend on, I mean, I think you can get an idea of the number of, I think it was 50% or 48% use 2 of those vendor products. Is that correct? So, I mean, you get half of the districts that did with the district survey only use 2 of those products. I mean, they're only going to have to the teachers should only have to answer, if the district survey data was correctly, then they should only have to answer two sets of questions about those 2 products, right? Because, you know, you're going to have very few teachers that are going to teach ELA and math and have to.
And as we did the district survey in our district, you know, we chose maybe 2 or 3 things that we chose. The answers to those questions were basically the same as we went through. So I think we could make an argument. I would propose us just making those questions below a global set of questions for the tested teachers and not make them go through and be looped for each individual assessment. We want to know what assessments they say they're using, and they could select those, but then not make them go through those questions one time and not loop them for each assessment that they're using. I do too.
I agree, because all of the information is important, but the information from those who are using 3 or more probably more important than the
All right, let me ask you this, and I'm, just for the sake of the data, and I'm not trying to be like contrary or anyway, but could we add a question? I hate adding a question too, but say, do you as a teacher, do you use these questions? Are all these products used similarly? And if you say yes, then they just answer the global. And if they say no, then maybe they can answer. You know what I'm saying? Because if they do use them, if they're all used the same, then they can say yes, and then they just answer the global. I don't know. I'm just trying to think out loud, I guess. I'm sorry. You get what I'm saying? Or does I understand what that would?
I don't know that they're going to know what that means. Yeah.
That's not worth the bite. A bark is not worth the bite type of deal. Okay.
I think we will get.
Can I make a suggestion? I think you do want to know, you do want the teachers to check all that apply, if you want to know that. But what you could do to reduce the burden on the teachers is to maybe have a statement to say, answer the following questions on the test that you use the most. In other words, then they could think about a specific test, because their answers might be different depending on which test they use. I mean, if it's something they use 5 or 6 times a year, or something they, only do once a year. I'm just thinking out loud.
I wouldn't say.
One do is mark all that apply, and then which of these tests do you use on a regular basis, and then you answer all the questions about that particular assessment.
I wouldn't say maybe not the one they use the most, because that might not be the one that they relied on data for. It might be the one that they rely mostly on, or is the majority that they put in the most stock in. The information. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I think there's value in knowing if they're not, if the test is not actually high leverage for them.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's value.
Absolutely.
If they're not using it and they're just doing it.
Yeah. I agree. Or it's a directive. Yeah. Or it's a directive from central office.
I believe that we would love. I think if we had the time and the energy, we would love to have it be a more robust set of data if we had the teachers answer the questions on each individual test. But for the sake of time and for the sake of them completing the survey and getting a representative sample, I think we're better off, instead of muddying the water, just having them select the test that they use, and then answer those questions generically from their viewpoint of testing. Yes.
I'll just say that some of the questions the responses you'll get won't make sense if you answer them for every test. So for example, how useful do you find this assessment? If they're doing STAR and iReady and CASE, they might find CASE extremely useful, and they might find iReady not useful at all. And then how do they answer that question? So, I mean, I don't know if this is something that we want to take up the entire task force time to like figure out what those questions are, but some of them you're not going to get useful data if they have to lump everything in together. There are definitely questions on the sheet that make sense to answer once and that's it. But other questions, depending on how many different products are used, are not, the data's just not going to make any sense because the teacher's going to say, I don't know how to answer this question because I have very mixed feelings about. And from at least from what we found, teachers had very strong opinions about whether or not they found different things useful.
Well, and in that respect, maybe that question number 11, to what degree do you as a teacher find this assessment helpful? You might want to ask that question and maybe one other question about every test they use. And then the generic test might make more sense. Things like, you know, the one that we spent a lot of time talking about, what is the intended purpose of assessment? Could that be applied globally? So you might want to think about it that way. You know, there's another question that, and then, you know, like in what month do you use assessment? Is that something you really need to know about every? I'm just asking.
I mean, at least for question 12, question 13, and question 14, whatever the district answered for those questions, the teachers are not going to answer it differently. You know, so the district's not going to say we take this computer-based, and then the teacher comes back and says it's oral.
Right. Or
you know,
13, if they tell us the type of assessment, we
already know the answer. That's right. Right. That would really only be for a question, for a test that's not, you know, because we already know iReady is what it is. Yeah.
You know, another question that might be good for globally is number 14. What is the length and minutes for the average administration? I mean, I don't know. Is that something you want to know on every test, or do you want to know that in general?
Yeah, that's another one that if we know what the assessment is, we should already know. Like if it's iReady, we know how long it's going to take. Only if it's an assessment that is not on that drop-down list would we need to know that.
But that is a question. Question 14 is a question where we might get differing views. District and people might think it doesn't take as long as a teacher does. You know, a teacher is going to give additional, you know, to get my class ready, to get this. You don't. I think that's a question we need to ask teachers because from a district level, okay, it doesn't take. We're not taking up much of your instructional time. From a teacher, they might think it's taking a lot longer. Yes.
I hear is the amount, the lost instructional time because of assessments.
Well, I think it's based off of, 14 is how much, and then 15 is the issues. It is. Yeah, that's why you're saying average. Yeah, yeah. But I'll tell you, teachers are going to add to that the time it takes to get kids ready to take it, how much time it takes them after they've taken it to get them back focused on instruction. They're not just going to give you the answer out of the manual that says it takes 30 minutes to take the test. It is. But I think it's something you want to
Also
know.
more realistic than what the district put from the.
Because the district put exactly what was in the manual, and it said it takes 20 minutes to take the test. That's what was put. Whereas the teacher's going to extend that.
So the purpose of the question is to get their perception, right?
Right.
Yeah, not the actual act of administration.
We in agreement to cut 12 and 13?
I mean, at least based on what was in the other data set, there weren't any surprises. You know,
Okay.
nobody said if it was STAR, it was people were going to say it was computer based, but it is.
Is there any value in 16 in knowing what months?
I would actually say, is there value? Do we think that the teacher answer is going to be significantly different from how the administrator, like how the district answered that question?
Do we ask them?
Yes, we asked what months of the year did you take STAR, and then how many times. So, for example, if people said we took it in August, December, and May, and then they said we took it 17 times.
Oh, so, okay, so to me that was different. Because this is in what month do you use this assessment. I guess I was thinking about the analysis part. So this is actually in what month do you administer the assessment. Is that the intent of question 16? Mm-hmm. Is administration? Okay.
In terms of best practice, we know there's been some differences in when we take the last assessment and how much time you had between then and the real MAPS assessment. And there's some difference in how people do that, whether you would give yourself 4 weeks and truly drive instruction by the last assessment, or whether you would just go up to 2 weeks before and do some type remedial type thing, which is a lesser best practice in my mind.
Have districts administering an assessment to students in July?
That was because there are potentially charter schools that might start in July, and because there were charter schools included in this, if they start in July and they give a diagnostic the week they start, they might be administering an assessment in July.
And when I read this question, I thought this was all about analysis. So I would have checked July to say, yes, we used the assessment results in July. I didn't think that was administration. I'm pretty little. So, okay. So this is admin.
Okay.
Oh, is that it? Is that it? No.
Yeah, we're going to cut. We're going to keep it or not?
And I mean, I would say you should cut it unless you think teachers are administering assessment outside of the school chosen schedule to every student.
No, I don't think so.
No.
So
Voluntary extra
So
administration.
let's cut 16 if we could, and we've got the answer to 17 already too. You know, when we did this survey together, Rachel, we didn't have the data back to know, so we have the answer to 17 as well, about the frequency.
Yes, we do.
So we could cut that one. Anything we can do to make this shorter for teachers will be.
I'll play devil's advocate since we cut some. Can we go back to questions 8 and 9 for non-tested teachers? I don't have those for tested teachers. I'm just wondering how valuable it would be to see the difference, if any, in a viewpoint of tested versus non-tested teachers. Yeah, which I'll entertain the idea of That technically is supposed to be where all teachers answer for those first. Then it says end of 2 months, which is already for non-tested teachers. Okay, so they will answer.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
never mind. Sorry.
Everybody will have those.
Great.
Yes.
Good.
I just don't like the word way on A, on the first one. I would like to remove way. Way too much. Yeah, too much. I'm an English teacher and that doesn't sound, yeah.
Okay, well, we don't want to prolong the time. Are there any other things that really are earth-shattering that would keep us from getting this out?
So have y'all decided to cut at least 4 questions? I recommend, if you want responses on every single test administered, then you need to reduce it. You really do. Because I am very worried about, respondent burden. You will have some dedicated teachers that'll spend as much time as it takes. But most teachers may not even give us 20 minutes, much less 30. So what is the most important information? So if you go that route, which I'm not saying you shouldn't, but if you want to know at least a couple of questions about every assessment, and the teacher does administer a lot, then I would strongly encourage you to move question number 21 up. Don't put it to last, because you're going to have people that are going to get tired and they're just going to quit.
No,
So a question like 21 that you want everybody to answer, I would move it up in the queue.
As I heard the consensus a while ago, we're not going to loop these questions and ask on every single test. We're going to ask these generically one time for those tested teachers, and we're going to cut question 12. We're going to cut question 13. We're going to cut question 16 and 17. And we're going to make the changes that we talked about to question 9.
Back to your point, Dr. Robertson, and we don't need question 21, isn't it? Just like question 8 and 9, everybody's going to be asked that. It's the same question as number 7, and so everyone's going to answer that in the first 10 questions.
That is correct, yes.
Well, but this really is a good global question, I think, because you're also having to rank order their challenges. I like that question. I think you'll get a lot of good information.
But look at question 7.
It's already listed there. It's already listed as question 7 on the first page, though. So it's the same question. So that if everyone answers those questions, they'll already have answered it.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I'm sorry. You're right. You're right. You don't need it then.
Most important person in the room, Ms. Guilfoyle, did you get all of this? Okay. So I think we're at a point where we can pull this together, and you might want to send it out to the task force members. Can we do that by the end today? And then check your emails, look at it one final time with the corrections that we made today, and then let's go ahead and get this sent to Mississippi State to get the ball rolling.
Yeah, I can send you the PowerPoint.
We got it already.
The next thing would be another meeting, and the purpose of that meeting, and when we come back together again. Yes. I think. Do we want to give time for our friends at Mississippi State, when would you, if we got you the survey by the end of the week and turnaround time for us to get it ready to go out to districts, what would you say?
Well, Dr. John Edwards is the person that's going to be programming this survey into, our system. The last time I talked to him about it, I thought maybe he would need a week and to do that. And then he may also have some questions along the same kind of lines about, that we were talking about today. But yeah, the other thing is the sooner you can get it to us, then the sooner he can get it programmed, because after that, then it's got to go out, and he wants to allow up to 3 reminder emails. That was our plan, unless you say otherwise, because sometimes people, ignore the first email sent to them about completing a survey. So that would take a couple of weeks too. So this is starting to stretch it out, and I thought y'all wanted a report by March. Was that what?
It would be very helpful for us to have, spring break for everyone, for most folks except for those on the coast, is the 11th through the 15th, and so if there was any way we could have the results, back maybe by the 8th or even the latest the 15th of March.
If you can get us this final survey back within a week, because I'm trying to do it backwards, how long it would take. We're already in the middle of January. We won't have much time to administer the survey and then analyze the results. If you put it off much longer.
So, task members, do we want to try to set a meeting date the 3rd week of March? That would be the week of March 18th through the 22nd. We'll go into the next week. You're getting the 25th through the 29th.
You're saying the week of March 23rd to the 29th?
That's for us to meet again. We would still like to maybe give you, if we meet the 25th through the 29th, then that gives you another week to get results analyzed and to us. So yes. Wednesday the 27th? Okay. Wednesday the 27th it is that we will have our next meeting here, and hopefully by that time we can have these results to add to, and maybe a further analyzation of the district results to look at as well, and get this information out to the public.
Can I ask a question? Would you want me or Dr. Edwards to be at the March 27th meeting?
Yes, ma'am. If that would work in your schedule, that would be wonderful.
Okay. I cannot meet that day, but I can talk to Dr. Edwards or perhaps send somebody in my place. I have another project meeting in Atlanta that whole week. But we could, I'll talk to him. We'll make sure that somebody is there to present the findings.
Okay, that sounds great. I see.
It said at the beginning that the survey will require about 30 to 40 minutes. Since we cut down so many questions, we need to change. 33 minutes seems pretty daunting for a teacher.
Yeah, probably 20 to 30 minutes would be more feasible now to complete it. Okay. If there's nothing else, or any other concerns or issues, if there's not, we will reconvene then on March the 26th. Thank you.